Now I begin with the prayer that I always like to begin any set of talks or a retreat with, because the prayer of St. Paul to me sums up everything that our lives should be about. This then is what I pray, kneeling before the Father, from whom every family, whether spiritual or natural, takes its name. Out of his infinite glory may he give you the power through his Spirit for your hidden self to grow strong, so that Christ may live in your hearts through faith. And then, planted in love and built on love, you will with all the saints have strength to grasp the breadth and the length, the height and the depth, until knowing the love of Christ, which is beyond all knowledge, you are filled with the utter fullness of God. Glory be to him whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Glory be to him from generation to generation in the Church and in Christ Jesus forever and ever. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That opening prayer from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians in many ways for me sums up what holiness is. But we've got a few talks to consider it, and I'll give you the plan. So my hope is if I give you the plan, I might stick to it, which will make the next set of the talks that follow much easier. The first thing that I want to do is to situate this Lent in our own time, which I think is an important thing to do. There's never a Lent which is the same as a previous Lent. There's never an Ash Wednesday the same to a previous one. There's never an Advent the same as a previous one, because we are different and our context is different. You've heard me talk about that, and I'll talk about what Lent is this year, at least for me. Then we'll turn to holiness and begin to open to you thoughts about what it is. But those thoughts will have to be developed in the next 3 talks. What is holiness? What's it about? What does it say about who we are? And then to open to you in a short way Gaudete et Exsultate, which was issued by Pope Francis in 2018 or something. I remember getting a copy for almost anyone I could get a copy for, 2018. So all the school principals got it, my priests got it, the staff got it, because I thought this is one of the most wonderful things written, because it's the Pope writing to us about what our life should be about. It's not theoretical. I'm tired of reading theological things in the Vatican. But when something is about what real life is about, I found it very important. And I'll just point out some of the initial things the Pope says, and then end tonight's session by identifying for the Pope obstacles to holiness, or very often what people consider to be the way to holiness, which are obviously not. And I'm delighted that the Pope pointed them out, because in the way he puts them, they're obstacles which we would probably many of us recognize, but he categorizes them in such a way that they make wonderful sense, these obstacles within the context of the profound tradition of spirituality, which we as Roman Catholics have, an extraordinary tradition. And then next week, I hope to begin to turn to saying, well, what is holiness? And above all else, holiness is given to us in the lives of holy people. And before we can talk about how to be holy, we have to begin to recognize what we see as holy and what this means, so that our striving can have purpose, meaning, and context. And then the last 2 weeks will be spent considering, well, if this is what holiness is and this is what the obstacles are, then what must I do? What must my enterprise be to be given that gift of holiness? And that will probably take up the last 2 sessions that we have. And when that's over, we're almost at the end of Lent. And you'll be delighted because we're moving into Easter, and that means we're almost to Christmas again. As I walked over here this evening, what struck me very powerfully was this is the 4th set of Lenten talks that I'm giving, which means I'm into my 4th Lent and my 4th Easter as your bishop. And I don't know whether as a consequence of being your bishop, I'm one iota holier than what I was when I arrived. But let's hope that these talks will throw some light on things. Okay, where are we as we begin this Lent? Because I think it's important so that we can situate aspiration for holiness in the light of the reality where we find ourselves. Since last Lent, these are the things which have been overwhelming us: drought, fire, and now more recently, the coronavirus. And in the midst of all of this, it doesn't matter which one we look at, drought, fire, or coronavirus, the experience is somewhat similar: helplessness, heaviness of heart, and a certain real sense when these things happen. These are not things which you celebrate with others, but these are things which reinforce very often a sense of powerlessness, emptiness, aloneness. It's a funny kind of thing. But I would be inclined to hazard a simple guess that as we begin this Lent, somehow or another, the universal experience of our people is picked up by these things. So much so that at work this afternoon, one staff member was saying that her son last weekend almost had a meltdown for fear of this thing called coronavirus. I wonder about, we need to know what's happening, but somehow you need to look at the BBC news. It's far more objective and enlightening and puts things in more objective perspective. But there's a lot of fear-mongering. Apparently the shops are being emptied out of things, which means that there's only one thing on people's minds, just as 2 months ago the fires were the only things on people's minds. And what this does to our experience of ourselves is it taps into a fundamental human weakness, a fundamental temptation. And that is the temptation to, in the midst of things, to withdraw into ourselves. That's what happens when we feel helpless. That's what happens in the midst of what's happening when we feel alone, powerless, burdened by something. These kind of experiences are not experiences which promote community, for example. And they, in a strange way, tap into something which has been part of Australian and Western society for many decades now. And that is the promotion of the individual over society and community, and the simple statement that we need to be self-reliant, independent. And when these kind of things happen, they undermine and attack, I believe, that kind of presumed way of thinking which we've had for quite some time. You would have trained your kids to be self-reliant and strong, not to be dependent and reliant upon others. And in the midst of that, suddenly, when the individual stands in the strength of self-reliance, which has been undermined these last 12 months, when the individual stands in that alone, they no longer need other people, because dependence upon others is weakness, and suddenly, in self-reliance, we turn our backs on God, because there is no need for that. And the challenge which emerges for me because for me, entering Lent is always a moment of prayer, just as the next big moment of prayer for me will be from Holy Thursday until the resurrection, because that's always virtually a time for me of a mini retreat. As I was engaged by that, kind of the temptation of the time and the temptation, I believe, of our people was very obvious. And it, for me, stood with the temptations of Christ. Because no doubt he would have had similar kinds of temptations. They're there. Exercise your power and your authority, is what Satan says to Jesus. And the answer is, no, I can't. Because I must live in dependence upon my Father in heaven. I must live relationally with others. And that dependence, that movement towards relation, is in fact at the heart of what he preaches in the gospel. Because the fundamental commandment of the gospel is the great commandment to love. Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbour as yourself. A threefold relationship which the gospel places before us at the beginning of Lent. Relationship with self, which is being undermined by the temptations of this moment, of this time. Relationship with others, which is being obscured by that sense of isolation and helplessness. And relationship with God, a God which society in so many ways has turned its back on, in such a way, not only do I not need God, but there is no God. And so in some ways, am I surprised at where we are at the beginning of this Lent? No, not at all. Because I'm not saying where this virus comes from, far be it from me to give a spiritual reason to it. But if our present context, as we pray about it, does not challenge us to move away from almost an ideological self-reliance and aloneness, back into relationship, which is what human life is about, and fundamentally into that relationship which is bounded in truth, which is relationship with God, then I have to wonder about things. That's where I begin Lent this year. And I would see, for me, this Lent as a challenge to stand strongly against the temptations to self-reliance, self-strength, in such a way that in the standing against such inner moves, I might grow into more profound relationship with my true self, with others, and with God. And to put it another way, that's the call to holiness. I decided upon this title before the coronavirus emergency, but I hasten to say that on reading the BBC that the number of people who are exposed to it, who catch it, is a very small percentage. But nevertheless, we must exercise due hygienic care. So I was saying to my priest who at the council meeting, a priest said, now, as you go home, learn to wash your hands often and well. That's the advice from your bishop. Wash your hands. And don't rub your eyes, don't rub your nose, and don't put your fingers in your mouth, because that's probably the surest way to maintain healthy. That's the way you catch a cold and the flu. Same thing. So that's the context for this Lent. And so the call now to move into a reflection on holiness, I think is a good thing to do. The Holy Father, 2 years ago now, decided this: I want to give not a treatise on holiness containing definitions and distinctions. My modest goal is to re-propose the call to holiness in a practical way for our time. For the Lord has chosen each one of us to be holy and blameless before him in love. That's from Ephesians, the prayer that I always begin with. So I want to begin with some simple reflections about holiness, which will point to the way forward. I think holiness, like love, is one of those things which we, in fact, in principle, cannot define. You can't say this is what holiness is, just as you can't say this is what love is. You can say this is not love, and you can say that's not holiness. The negative can be specified, but we want to know what it is, because that's our human way of thinking. I can't give it to you directly, but I can say this to you about holiness. I have seen holiness, and I'm sure you have too. The first thing to say to you is to begin to open your eyes to recognize holiness. That's what the Holy Father wants us to do, to recognize the holiness in others. The high examples of holiness are the great saints, as Saint Teresa of Lisieux writes about. When she speaks, she says, I am like a little swallow compared to the great eagles. And she says, who are they? St. Paul, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Teresa of Avila, who for her are great because they manifest and make present holiness. And yet in a strange way, her littleness is in fact one of the greatest articulations of what holiness is. So holiness is not the preserve of the high and mighty. As the Pope says, and as St. Francis de Sales says in his book, The Devoted Life, you don't have to be a contemplative to be a saint. You don't have to be a bishop to be holy. I mean, if we go through the list of bishops, you might be scandalized at what you see. So this is not where you go to see holiness. The first place that we look to identify holiness is each other. Many people have said to me, because I've been your bishop now for just over 3 years, people still ask me, are you enjoying being bishop? My answer is the same. If I wanted to enjoy myself, I wouldn't be bishop. It's not the thing you do if you want to enjoy yourself. But if you ask me, am I happy being Bishop of Lismore? Yes, I am. And the question, why? It's because in 3 years I've seen so much goodness. I've seen so much love. And so much love has been expressed to me for no reason in myself that it should have been given to me. Gratuitous goodness. That's holiness. And I have seen that since I've been bishop, day after day after day, in the people around me. What is holiness? The first thing we need to do is to recognize it in each other. And this, in fact, is what the Holy Father writes more eloquently than what I'm saying. This is what he says. I need to find it because we are all called to be holy by living our lives with love and by bearing witness in everything we do, wherever we find ourselves. Are you called to the consecrated life? Then be holy by living out your commitment with joy. Are you married? Be holy by loving and caring for your husband or wife. Do you work for a living? Be holy by labouring with integrity and skill in the service of your brothers and sisters. Are you a parent or a grandparent? Be holy by patiently teaching the little ones how to follow Jesus. Are you in a position of authority? Be holy by working for the common good and renouncing personal gain. The Pope goes on to say something which it struck me most remarkably. And he says, holiness is the most attractive face of the church. I'll say that again. It might be the thing from this that I remember most of all. Holiness is the most attractive face of the church. And in this time of the church's history, it is what we need to show. Not in a false way, but if people can see the holiness of the people of God, then they will see the best that the church has to offer. Rather than what we're criticised for, clericalism, institutionalism, living in ways that are inconsistent with the gospel and what we preach. But all the Pope is saying, and St. Francis de Sales, is live, as St. Francis would say, devotion is the word that he uses. Holiness is what Pope Francis uses. Live this in your life now. And we'll turn to see what that means in a minute. And then I have to turn to what he sees as contemporary problems, which I think is a very powerful thing. And just before we move on, very often it is a holiness found in our next door neighbours who live in our midst that reflect God's presence. So we haven't defined holiness except to say, now if there is such a thing, you should be able to find it and see it. And in the midst of that, the simple statement is, I believe holiness is in everyone, and I hate to say even in myself. Because if I don't believe that there's holiness in me, how can I recognize the holiness in you? And this is what St. Therese would speak of when she speaks about love. This is the lifeblood of the church. So why do we turn to holiness? Because it's given to us in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, where Yahweh says to the people of God, be holy because I am holy. I hope to spend time reflecting upon this, but I need to give you a few simple things, general things, before we can come back to look at it. I learnt that from my economics teacher, who in fact, his wife is related by marriage to my PA, Nancy Tarlington, because his wife is one of the readings from out at, what's that place up the road from P, beginning with B? Bangalore. There's a big store called Readings. Well, my economics teacher, who now is almost 80, but he was a young man when he taught me in his 30s. One thing he did teach me, it was an extraordinary teacher. He said to us, and I remembered many things, understand the general picture before you try to look at the detail. Because without that, the detail will make no sense. So I'm at the moment giving you a bit of the big picture so that you will see. So what is holiness? I can't say, but you can see it. And you must see it in others and in yourself. Why holiness? Because God is holy. And that is one of the most extraordinary things in the Bible. And it's repeated by Jesus Christ, but differently. You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Implicitly, he says, you must forgive because your Father forgives. And he says, you must be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. So there's a whole line of teachings which comes to us from the very beginning of the Bible, which says, God is this, and you as a human being are called to be that also. That's a most extraordinary statement, because if God is this, how is it possible for me to be that? Because I'm only a human being. I'm finite. I'm dependent. I'm a sinner. If God is this, how is it possible for me to be this? And with that question, the quest for holiness and what holiness is suddenly expands into something which is most extraordinary. Because the call of every human being is to be godlike. That's what the quest of holiness is about. It's not about being pious. It's not about being holy in this pious sense of the word, but the call to be holy is the call to be like God. And that call is only possible because of two things. I have the capacity to be like God, and that is what I was spiritually made for. Humanly, St. Thomas Aquinas will propose a very high goal of human life, which we all recognize well. He says the human goal of life is happiness. It's a wonderful thing to hear from the greatest theologian that the church has ever had. It's not to be unhappy or to be bound down by things. Now, sometimes we have to shout this out to members of the church. No. It's not to be unhappy and miserable. The goal of human life is happiness, but that's another story as to what that means. That's not what our Lenten talks are about. But then we move on to the next step, which we find in the writings of St. John of the Cross. Your spiritual purpose is holiness because you are made to be like God. And you might say, well, where does that come from? We've got it in St. John, the evangelist, and we've got it in St. Paul. And we've got it in all the great early church writers, except somehow, in the midst of all the other things which we talk about, it's got lost somewhere, which is why it was such a relief when the Holy Father issued this document about holiness. So what is holiness? First of all then, the extraordinary thing about holiness, it says something about us. It says something about you and something about me. It says you can be holy, whatever that means, which is what we're going to look at more carefully next week. But this is what you're made for. This is what you can be. And in some extraordinary sense, unless we walk that path, we can never be what St. Thomas Aquinas proposes as the human purpose of life. You can never be happy. Because if the spiritual is not in place, the human also will not be conformed somehow to God. Holiness. You might begin by saying now, well, this sounds like, Bishop, you're asking us to aim for something which you might say to me, had thought was beyond me. This is too much for me. St. Teresa of Avila will step in here and say something very powerful. Do not limit your desires. St. Teresa of Lisieux says the same thing. Your possibility is infinite. So in these matters, do not limit yourself. And St. Teresa of Avila has this wonderful saying, which I learnt in my first year as a Discalced Carmelite. I was taught this by my novice master. If you desire anything, desire to desire more. Because if you desire anything less than that, you're desiring something which is not good enough for you. Desire to desire more, and do not be afraid to desire and to launch out in these kind of things for something which you think is beyond you. Because you're more than you think you are. That's in fact what any pursuit of holiness places upon us. Okay, we will come back to this next week, because next week I propose to look at Jesus Christ and to some saints to begin to recognize in the articulation of holiness what we see in another person. But we should be able to look at each other. I see holiness in my office where I work. I see holiness in my priest. I see holiness where I go. I see holiness in my friends and my family. I see holiness in family members who are not Christians. You know, the first thing before we look at the obstacles, open your eyes. If you look for what is the contrary of holiness, that's all you'll ever see. But if you open your eyes to the goodness of God, you might see God. Because seeing God is the same as seeing holiness. Okay, we need to change gears, because the last thing I want to put in is something which I think, well, for me, in terms of because I've read spirituality for a long time, the two obstacles that the Holy Father presents. And to give you the technical word, it's a new form of Gnosticism and a new form of Pelagianism. Don't worry what the words are, but if you're skilled in any kind of theology, you might have some sense of what it is. But there is within all of us something that we hold on to somehow justify and to give some kind of direction to what we're doing. Yes, one thing that I have learnt is, and I've not learnt much, but in 35 years in the Carmelite order, I have learnt that the things that I've relied upon, I should not have relied on. And in the mercy of God, Jesus has taken them from me. Because what's the path to holiness? What does it feel like? Well, I can't swim. But I imagine it's like this, being set afloat on a raft in an ocean. And you've got no control of where it's going. And all you want to do is hold on to something. And somehow the way forward in holiness is letting go. There are two kinds of things that the Holy Father recognizes. And because he put it this way, it was kind of like an illumination for me. He says, we hold on to things with our mind, or we hold on to things with our will. Let me say what he means. The first one goes back to an ancient heresy called Gnosticism, which goes back to about the 2nd and the 3rd century, very ancient. And it goes something like this. My faith and my relationship with God is grounded in what I know. And what I know is all I need. That means that somehow, and I'll give examples soon, it's a kind of thinking which says, I can grasp the things of God, and so long as I've got these, everything will be right. What are examples of this? As the Holy Father says, people for whom orthodoxy is the only thing that matters. And the obvious thing, of course, is, but where does love fit in? And people who will walk around trying to find bishops and priests who say things which are not orthodox. What they are doing, the Holy Father, and correctly says, because I'll give you the spiritual principles behind it. Such people have said, I can hold God in a box of knowledge. And the simple truth is, God is a mystery. And the truth, in fact, should take us more and more to the edge of the mystery, so that as a consequence of what I know, I can say, I don't know. As John of the Cross says, if you have a choice of walking in the path of knowing and not knowing, choose the path of not knowing, because that will bring you closer to God. And what the Holy Father is recognizing in the contemporary church, but it's always been there, that the way to live the Christian life, the way to stand in the presence of God, is defined by statements which are about the truth. But if you turn to the greatest theologian of the church, the only statement of truth for Thomas Aquinas which could be said in such a way that it was understandable was this one. The statement that God does not exist is false. And he says, we all know what that means. It's the only theological truth that can be said with absolute certainty as to what it means. And the simple thing is, beware of equating your relationship with God with what you know. Because what you know fits in your head and God won't fit in there, to put it simply. And what is more important in the spiritual tradition, it's not what I know, but how what I know leads me to stand in the presence of God and into a relationship with love, of love with Him. So that I stand not in the presence of what I know, but what I know enables me to let go of things, so that I can stand simply in the presence of God. Because the experience is relational. And the Holy Father recognizes that movement towards love and towards holiness is not a movement into definitions and knowledge, because no definition can give me God. Somehow, what can give me God? For me is, in my life, prayer. To pray, to sit in the presence of God, even when God doesn't seem to be there, so that God can break into my life. I cannot break into the life of God, and certainly not by what I know. The next obstacle he puts is again another ancient heresy called Pelagianism, which St. Augustine was the main anti-Pelagian and doctor of the church. But it basically says this, that I can, the Pelagian says, God gives the rules and you've got everything you need to do it. And St. Augustine says, that's a heresy, because I can't do anything without the grace and the help of God. The rules are not enough. And the form that the Holy Father recognizes goes a bit like this. The way to heaven is by doing this, 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 and this. Every day I do this, every day I do that. Whatever it is, it may be a set of prayers, and that might be a good thing. It might be different things, rules that you establish for your life, but none of this guarantees a way to God. Because, as the great mystics say, if God loves you, he has to break these things down. Because there's no formula. That said, you'll wonder what I'm going to say in the third talk. I'm not going to give you a formula for walking to holiness, but I'm going to give you a way of moving to holiness. Because no formula works. Because every individual's way to holiness is unique. There's never ever been a person like you, and you have your path to holiness. That's why rules don't work. And it's those people who say, well, I'm safe if I just do this. No. It's more than that. Because that means that the path to holiness is reduced to a rule book. But as an imam said to me, as I said this to you once before, I took my novices one year to the mosque and for their open day at Auburn. And because we wore our habits, we were ushered aside to speak with so that they could have a theological discussion with these men in brown habits. So the imam was, and we were talking away, and we got to the point of talking about religion, and the imam said, as far as I'm concerned, Christianity is not a religion. As I said, one of my novices wanted to get up and hit him one. I said, just be quiet and listen. I said, why? And he said, well, Judaism, I don't think is a religion because you have to belong to the people of Israel. Islam is a religion because religio, it's about laws and rules. We keep these rules and we get to heaven. And he said, for me, the problem with Christianity is it's all about relationship. At which point my novices' mouths dropped because I've been trying to teach them this for ages. I never understood a word. And when the imam said this, they understood. Because Christianity is love God, love your neighbour as yourself. And notice Jesus doesn't give us regulations. He doesn't. We might talk about what the place of regulations and what the place of knowledge is, because it does have a place. But it's not the sine qua non, it is not the way. And when we hold on to them as if they have a place beyond the place they should have, they become obstacles in our path to holiness, as the Holy Father says to us. And I thought that was quite remarkable when I read that. I thought, wow, I've learnt something quite wonderful in his way of teasing it out and thinking about it. And I thought to myself, I agree with that fully, because as a Discalced Carmelite, where John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila are perhaps, I have to say perhaps, but I would say I'm certainly so, but I have to be humble and say perhaps the greatest teachers in terms of the spiritual life. They would agree with what the Holy Father said, because what he says taps into the Discalced Carmelite categories. Not surprising, because his favourite spiritual writer is Teresa of Lisieux. And in Argentina, he was a great friend of the order in many ways. So I've been talking 45 minutes. My aim will be about 45 minutes, because the problem is, I've worked out at a certain point, if I say anything more, to push things out the other ear. So let's pause to see if you've got any questions or comments. Did that make sense? Could you hear me down the back? Bing, could you hear me down the back? Oh, good. Alex could hear me, but he's younger. He's got good ears. Thoughts or questions, please? Hands up and there's a microphone. If not, I'll go home and cook my dinner. Bing, you're standing up. Have you got a question? Have you got the microphone? Look, sometimes it's hard to ask me questions because very often what I give could well be the first time you've heard it. And Joe Pereira is going to put this up in the sky somewhere. How you find it, I don't know. You can listen to it again, watch it again. There's a question down the back here, and then you can bring the questions next week.
Hello,
Peter.
Yes. Bishop, what's the relationship or the difference between holiness and wholeness?
Between
holiness
yep,
and wholeness.
and wholeness. Okay, I mean, I think there's a relationship, because when we speak about wholeness, another word comes to mind, which is integrity. I think that holiness, if there is holiness, there must be a degree of integrity. But integrity, they're not the same. integrity, I don't think, is enough for the fullness of holiness, because in the spiritual tradition, beyond integrity, in fact, is the utter loss of self. It's that thing where, what was I reading recently, that in fact, I don't want to frighten you, but the path to holiness is a path of great self-loss. I don't think it follows that the path to integrity includes such self-loss, because the path to full holiness is the path to utter self-emptying so far as we can do it. Where we can't, to the inner purification which makes possible being filled with the fullness of God. And I'm not sure that integrity demands being so filled with the utter fullness of God, the kind of thing that St. Paul writes about in his prayer in the Ephesians. So I think there is a difference, but they are related, because I don't think we can come to any degree of holiness without moving on the path of integrity, because lack of integrity will identify for us in terms of the virtue of humility, which will be in our third talk, will identify for us where growth and change needs to happen. And in the movement to that integrity, demanded by the experience of humility, that's part, I think, Peter, of the movement to holiness. But holiness has within it what's the spiritual writers speak about as the passive night of spirit. And I don't think that's necessary for integrity. It's another thing. And I probably won't talk about that unless someone asks the right question, because it's quite complex. And it's something that I've studied, but I do not yet know from experience the passive night of spirit. That's why I look so hopeful. Anyone else? Michael? Okay, I better say to them what you're saying to me because they can't hear. Michael's question fundamentally is, in the path to holiness, what place do rules and regulations have? I like to think of it like a swimming pool. The swimming pool is defined by concrete, and that's kind of in some ways what kind of the rules of living good life are about. But unless you put water in, which is love, you've got nothing to swim in. And so these rules and things somehow give some kind of definition, but the definition is not what life is about. These rules give definition so as to make possible love, to make possible relationship. Because to live, let's just use the 10 Commandments. To live the 10 Commandments doesn't guarantee love. But if you don't live them, then you've got a lot of growing in love. But failures in the 10 Commandments doesn't mean that you don't love. That's why we have the sacrament of reconciliation. So you can't place your trust in keeping commandments, because by doing that, according to the Neo-Pelagian problem which the Pope specifies, if you place your trust in rules and regulations, you might not be obeying the fundamental commandment of Jesus, which is to love. And by placing all your hope and trust in them, you're not placing your trust in God. You're not placing your trust in Jesus Christ. It's the same kind of thing with knowledge. Don't place your trust in what you know, but in the uncomfortable experience of placing your trust in someone that you can't see. Placing your trust in God. It's much easier placing your trust in rules or in things you understand than placing your trust in someone. But that someone is what being Christian is about. Okay, well that's taken us to 7 o'clock. You've got, unless there's another pressing question, you've got the possibility to go over it again, because as I've become very well aware, My thoughts make sense to me, but for many people you're thinking, what's he talking about? And don't be afraid to ask the question, what are you talking about? Because if you don't understand, it could well mean that I don't either. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Thank you.